There's a lot of reasons why players like overstable discs. When you hear pros talk about them, they refer to them as reliable, dependable, consistent. But what does that make understable discs? Unreliable? Erratic? Inconsistent? Yeah, basically. But what if there's a way that you could fine-tune your understable discs to get them just right? Let's find out, because the disc is in the details. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs, and today's video is sponsored by me. For some of our videos, we're able to reach out to companies and get samples to test. But more often than not, we buy the discs that we're going to test, compare, and explore for your information and entertainment. So if you like the content we create and would like to help offset the cost of our videos, please consider picking up your next disc from sixsideddiscs.com at the link in the video description. And thanks. But enough about that, let's talk about stability. When you think about overstable discs like a Firebird or Destroyer, nearly everyone agrees that they are overstable, because they will continue to be overstable unless you throw insanely fast. But when it comes to understable discs, things start to get tricky. The speed at which an understable disc flies, true to its flight numbers, is much narrower. Let's take the Discraft Heat for example. We featured the Heat in a video last year where we had players at different skill levels throwing the same disc, and we got 5 very different flights, from very overstable to straight and quite understable. But if all 5 of those players threw a Firebird, a very overstable disc, they would all see a fairly similar result. Now we're going to see this concept in action on the course and in the field with the Mint Disc's Salamander in just a minute. To better explain this concept, I've spent frankly way too much time designing this chart as a visual reference, so bear with me while I break it down and explain how it works. From left to right, we're visualizing throws in miles per hour. Assuming most disc golfers fall roughly within the 40 mile an hour to 80 mile an hour range. For reference, world distance record holder David Wiggins Jr. has 2 throws measured on Tech Disc's website at 84.7 and 76.2 miles per hour respectively. That averages out to about 80 miles an hour. While Caleb Thomas, who you see throwing on our channel often, is throwing around 60 miles per hour, I myself am firmly in the low to mid 50 mile an hour range. Now, how I'm trying to visualize this is using the y-axis as a measure of how much more overstable or understable a disc is at specific arm speeds when compared to the flight numbers. And yes, of course, I'm aware that there's tons of other factors that affect how a disc is ultimately going to fly. Spin rate, nose angle, launch angle, plastic, and so on. But for the sake of this example, we're just going to simplify and only focus on speed. So on this chart, the top section is way more overstable than you would expect that disc to fly. Discs that are going to be fading immediately and aggressively, regardless of the flight numbers. For example, when my son threw the Discraft Heat. And then as we move down, we get to discs that are flying a little more overstable than the flight numbers, like how it flew for Raven in this Heat video. And then, of course, we have the Goldilocks zone, where a disc is flying exactly the way it was designed to fly, right in the middle. And of course, as we move down, they start to get much more understable than the flight numbers would suggest. So for our first example, let's visualize an Innova Firebird and assume that it's max weight in champion plastic. For most players, including me right around here, it's going to be very overstable, maybe even a touch more overstable than the flight numbers suggest. But as you get into the high 60 mile an hour to 70 mile per hour range, a Firebird flies exactly how it's designed to. However, there obviously has to be a drop off at some point. And maybe it's not even on this chart. It might be much faster beyond what I'm showing here or in a headwind. But you get the idea. At a certain point, even a Firebird isn't overstable. Now, if we compare that to a torque resistant but neutral flying disc like the Buzz from Discraft, it's a very different visual. The Buzz is more usable for more players, and while it may be slightly more overstable or understable for some, it's not so extreme. Okay, still with me? I hope so. Now that we understand how we're going to use this chart, let's take a step back from it and take a look at the Mint Disc's Salamander. Rated at 6'6", -2'1", the Salamander is a new finesse fairway driver from Mint Discs, and it's likely to become a fan favorite, much like the Lobster before it, for appealing to lower speed throwers. But I want to take a second to play out a real world experience that I've had that I assume many of you have also had. Let's say you're bagging an understable disc. You've thrown it for some time and it's been reliably understable. But then one day you go out to the course and it doesn't turn over. And next week you have the same problem. And now this disc that used to be reliably understable isn't. Now, nothing has changed about the disc. Something's probably changed about you and how you're throwing or the conditions, but you decide it's time to try a different disc. So you go to your local retailer and you decide you really like the feel of the mint Salamander. But here's the catch. There's only one Salamander at the store and it weighs 155 grams. But you say, whatever, let's give it a try. So you take it out to the course and you start throwing it. And you quickly find out that despite having flight numbers of 66, -21, it is much more understable than advertised, getting a huge turn. So what if you want the same feel and shape of that disc, but something that has a little more stability? Well, you could try this. This is also a mint disc Salamander, and it is the same plastic, same shape, and nearly the same color. But it's 20 grams heavier at 175 grams. On the same angle, it turns over and holds that turn, but eventually it finds some low speed fade. And it's also much more controllable, at least for my arm speed, because I can throw it a bit harder on hyzer and then watch it quickly flip to flat and begin to hold that smooth turn without burning out. But this illustrates just how tricky it is to find the right understable disc for your arm speed. A 20-gram difference takes this from being usably understable to sort of uncontrollably understable. And while the Firebird is pretty overstable for pretty much everyone, and the Buzz is more predictable, the Salamander and many other understable discs isn't. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, it's just a quirk of understable discs. But now let's take a look at how that would look on our handy chart. This light orange line is how we would visualize the 155-gram Salamander. Every time you add a little bit of speed, you get a much bigger change in stability than the Firebird or Buzz. And by the time you give this disc to Caleb and take it past 60 miles an hour, it's barely going to be usable, as we can see here. But if you add that extra 20 grams of weight and plot it again on our chart, in this darker orange color, you see it can handle more speed, and it moves that Goldilocks zone over to a new set of players and arm speeds. Now you can fine tune this, of course. Here's an example of a 165-gram Salamander that would fit right in between these two. But weight is obviously not the only variable that you can change, because of course eventually you get to a point where you can't add or take away any more weight, and you have to move on to maybe a more overstable plastic, or, of course, a completely different disc. Nevertheless, I think that this chart does help better visualize a concept that many of us use when we're shopping for, testing, and choosing discs. And better understanding the relationship between how you throw, a disc that you want to use, and how you can fine-tune it for your game might just make finding the next disc you want a little bit easier. What do you all think of this concept, though? It's a little bit out there in terms of visuals that I've tried to create. Leave a comment down below. And also comment below if you've thrown the mint disc Salamander, and if you think it'll be another cult favorite like the Lobster. Remember, the disc is in the details. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. We are ready. There's a lot of reasons people like overstable discs. There's a lot of reasons why players like overstable discs. Unreliable, erratic, inconsistent. Yeah, basically. What in the world? If you like this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, or supporting us on Patreon. Your support makes this content possible.